scrolls that were buried in volcanic ash.
Of the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. In it, they found a library with 1,800 ancient scrolls with texts in Greek.
It began with a fragment, a piece of clay no larger than a human palm, unearthed from a site long abandoned to the silence of shifting sands. Archaeologists had dismissed it at first as a curiosity among thousands of relics, its markings too eroded and obscure to yield meaning through traditional study. For decades, the artifact sat in storage, cataloged and forgotten. Then, a team of researchers, armed with a powerful new artificial intelligence trained on linguistic structures far beyond the capacity of human analysis, fed the fragment's patterns into the system. Within hours, the AI produced a translation, not in hesitant conjectures, but in flowing, confident sentences. The text it revealed spoke of knowledge buried before the dawn of recorded history, knowledge that no living culture had preserved, and it did not whisper of peace or beauty. It spoke of warnings. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The language in question belonged to a civilization predating the known Great River cultures. It had no connection to any known linguistic family, yet the AI identified patterns of morphology and syntax that hinted at a complexity rivaling, perhaps surpassing, modern languages. What startled the researchers was not the fact that the AI could decode it. This was expected from the advanced neural models capable of mapping abstract meaning from mere fragments, but the content itself. The message described a world eerily similar to our own, yet not our own. A place plagued by cycles of environmental collapse and societal unrest. It described the cycle in such exacting detail that the lines between ancient myth and scientific prediction blurred to nothing. As more artifacts were processed, the AI began to stitch together a continuous historical narrative from scattered inscriptions, carvings, and faded scrolls. This civilization had apparently mapped patterns of planetary climate, orbital variations, and solar activity with precision that should have been impossible without telescopes, satellites, or even the mathematics of later ages. The descriptions detailed long-term shifts in temperature, drought cycles, and coastal flooding, recorded not as mystical visions but as empirical observations. This was already startling. But what unsettled the team most was the uncanny alignment between those ancient projections and the current global climate models. The parallels were so exact that they could be overlaid century upon century, point for point, as though the ancient seers had somehow measured the same variables scientists monitor today. The AI, relentless in its processing, uncovered another dimension to the texts, a series of prophecies not in the mystical sense, but written as direct forecasts, warnings to future societies. These warnings referred to something the AI translated as the threshold event, a point after which the collapse of global systems could not be reversed. The descriptions of this threshold were chilling in their specificity, cascading failures in food production, mass displacement of populations, and the sudden destabilization of political orders. What was particularly unnerving was the timeline. Although the dating system of the ancient culture was alien, the AI converted it into modern reckoning. The date given for the threshold fell alarmingly close to the present century. There were details that gnawed at the researchers, especially in passages describing what they called the shrouding. This event was depicted in both literal and metaphorical terms. Skies darkened for years, the stars obscured, great migrations of desperate people moving toward dwindling sources of sustenance. The cause of the shrouding was never directly stated, only hinted at through imagery of fires that do not end and waters that rise without storm. The AI suggested multiple plausible interpretations: volcanic activity, nuclear winter, or a catastrophic shift in ocean currents, but none were reassuring. Equally disturbing was the realization that these writings seemed directed. Many inscriptions were phrased as if speaking to readers in the far future. The AI noted that certain phrases and grammatical structures were repeated in a way that resembled mnemonic encoding, a method designed to ensure comprehension by those unfamiliar with the original culture. This suggested the ancients may have anticipated their language being lost, yet deliberately built a pathway for its recovery. If that were true, then the arrival of AI decoding technology might not have been an accident of history, but the fulfillment of a design set in motion thousands of years ago. The archaeological record grew darker as more sites were examined. One dig revealed a series of tablets buried in a specific pattern, almost like a time capsule. They described a series of societal decisions that hastened collapse, choices made for short-term gain despite clear evidence of their long-term consequences. The AI translated these accounts into stark clinical language: the overexploitation of natural resources, the centralization of power into fewer hands, and the deliberate suppression of knowledge that might have prolonged societal survival. The parallels to modern events were unavoidable, and the unease among the researchers deepened. One of the most haunting discoveries was a set of inscriptions located far from any known settlement, carved into stone deep within a cave system. These inscriptions were accompanied by intricate diagrams that the AI initially struggled to interpret. After weeks of computation, it concluded that the diagrams represented a map, though not of any physical geography on Earth as it is known today. Instead, the map seemed to chart shifting coastlines, altered river courses, and submerged land masses, as if depicting Earth in a radically changed climate state. The inscriptions explained this map as a warning to those who walk in the age of heat and shadow. As the translations piled up, the researchers began to notice another layer of information encoded within the texts: subtle patterns of numerical sequences hidden in the arrangement of words. When analyzed, these sequences corresponded to astronomical cycles, including precession and axial tilt, but with a precision far beyond what historians believed ancient peoples could have achieved. This implied a continuity of observation over spans of time exceeding any single human lifetime, suggesting either a culture of extreme record-keeping discipline or the existence of methods and instruments now lost to history. Perhaps the most disquieting element in the recovered language was the recurring assertion that these cycles were not purely natural. Several inscriptions implied that the threshold event had occurred in earlier epochs not solely because of environmental factors, but because of human or human-like actions that accelerated the decline. The AI, limited by its training data, could only speculate on the meaning of terms like the Builders of Ash or the Eaters of the Sky, but it rendered these phrases with a consistency that left little doubt they referred to agents of destruction, whether literal or symbolic. As the AI translated more material, it began to identify tonal shifts within the language, as though the civilization itself had passed through phases of optimism, resignation, and finally desperation. Early inscriptions celebrated harmony between human communities and their environment, full of detailed records of agricultural yields, astronomical events, and festivals. Later texts grew terse, focused on shortages, conflicts, and the dwindling number of safe regions to inhabit. In the final phase, the writings were dominated by instructions: how to store food, how to preserve seeds, how to locate underground water sources. These last records gave the distinct impression of a people preparing not for recovery, but for survival during an inevitable collapse. The realization that these instructions were written with the future in mind was not lost on the team. The AI flagged repeated phrases urging those who come after to learn from the past, to heed the cycles, and to resist the temptations that led to the threshold. Yet the very fact that this civilization had fallen despite possessing such foresight cast a long shadow over any optimism. If they could see it coming and still fail to prevent it, what did that imply for those standing on the edge of their own threshold today? Among the most perplexing translations was a passage describing an invisible turning that precedes the collapse. It spoke of a moment when the signs are present yet ignored, when leaders dismiss warnings as illusions, and when ordinary people choose to believe in a stability that no longer exists. The AI's statistical model linked this concept to modern ideas of tipping points and systemic inertia, but the poetic framing of the original text carried an almost tangible dread. Not all the material was purely descriptive. Several inscriptions seemed to contain what could only be described as protocols, step-by-step processes for mitigating disaster. These protocols were encoded in an almost algorithmic structure, suggesting that the ancients understood the value of procedural knowledge long before the digital age. The AI rendered these with startling clarity: population relocation plans, agricultural diversification, and even methods for safeguarding critical knowledge in forms resistant to decay. Yet there was no evidence these measures had succeeded. The final records were as bleak as any collapse narrative. The team could not help but speculate about the nature of the civilization itself. How had they acquired such advanced observational knowledge without the tools known to modern science? The AI hinted at the possibility that their methods relied heavily on generational continuity, where each generation was trained to carry forward specific observational tasks with absolute fidelity. Others suggested they might have inherited knowledge from an even older, unknown culture. The translations did not answer this directly, but they contained enough tantalizing hints to fuel years of debate. The discovery did not merely challenge historical timelines, it threatened the comfort of believing that humanity's present crises were unprecedented. The AI's translations painted a picture of deep time in which civilizations rose and fell not in linear progress, but in repeating arcs, each forgetting the warnings of its predecessors. The ancient language, once silent for millennia, now spoke with unsettling clarity. The cycles were not accidents, and the patterns were visible to those willing to look. What made the revelation terrifying was not just the alignment with modern predictions, but the suggestion that the patterns were not merely environmental. There were passages implying that collapse was often accelerated by deliberate actions, wars over dwindling resources, the hoarding of knowledge by elites, and the exploitation of the very systems that sustained life. These were not acts of ignorance but of calculated choice, echoing decisions visible in the headlines of the modern world. The AI's translation engine worked without bias or agenda, but the sheer volume of warnings it uncovered began to feel almost accusatory. It was as though the ancient civilization, in its final moments, had turned to address those who might one day hold the same fate in their hands. The words, stripped of their original context yet alive with meaning, carried a simple but devastating implication. The threshold comes not because it must, but because it is chosen. And so in a quiet research facility far from the ancient ruins, a modern language emerged for an ancient truth. The clay fragments and weathered carvings were no longer inert artifacts. They were voices, speaking across the abyss of time, urging those who would listen to break the cycle before it closed again. Yet the AI offered no assurance that such warnings, however clear, would be enough. It could only translate. The rest depended on those who now stood where others had once stood, staring into the shadow of their own threshold. The pace of discovery only accelerated after the first wave of translations. Once the AI had established a functional lexicon for the ancient language, it began to process materials that had resisted every previous attempt at interpretation. Entire storerooms of unexamined artifacts, dismissed for decades as ornamental or indecipherable, suddenly became readable records. Clay tablets, bone carvings, woven textiles with repeating symbols, even bead arrangements found in burial sites, all were revealed to be carriers of information. The AI treated each as part of a vast interlocking data set, aligning them into a coherent chronology that stretched so far back it forced a re-evaluation of the boundaries of recorded history. What emerged was a portrait of a civilization with an almost obsessive relationship to time and measurement. The AI found that their calendar system extended over spans of thousands of years, divided into recurring intervals that correlated with shifts in climate and astronomical phenomena. They did not measure time solely by days or seasons, but by cycles of change, as though they saw history itself as a kind of repeating weather. Their words for these cycles were precise and layered. One term denoted an immediate seasonal rhythm, another described the broader arc of generations, while still another referred to the turning of ages in which entire civilizations might rise or vanish. Each cycle was marked by an anticipated moment of crisis, which they called the crossing, a point at which the old pattern would break and a new one would emerge, often at great cost. The AI's capacity for pattern recognition made it clear that these crossings were not imagined. The ancient records included detailed accounts of floods, famines, disease outbreaks, and mass migrations, all positioned within these cyclical frameworks. The people seemed to expect these events as inevitabilities, yet their writings contained a strange duality. They warned of catastrophe while simultaneously documenting elaborate rituals and preparations aimed at surviving it. These preparations were not merely spiritual. They included construction of massive storage facilities, migration routes carved into rock faces, and instructions for cultivating hardy, fast-growing food sources. One translation described something akin to an early warning system. The system involved observation posts built on high ground, each manned by trained watchers who recorded shifts in wind patterns, animal migrations, and the positions of celestial bodies. The information they gathered was sent through messengers or encoded markers to a central council. From there, decisions would be made on whether to activate contingency plans. What struck the research team was how methodical and bureaucratic this process seemed, more like the operation of a modern disaster management agency than the behavior of a prehistoric community. The AI calculated that the complexity of such a system would have required not just organization, but a shared belief in the importance of long-term planning. But the translations also uncovered fractures within their society. The AI identified two distinct registers in the language, formal and vernacular, and noted that certain warning inscriptions appeared in the formal register only, suggesting they were restricted to an educated elite. Vernacular records, often scratched onto pottery shards or woven into garments, revealed a different narrative: skepticism, confusion, and sometimes outright defiance toward the warnings from the ruling class. This implied that not everyone accepted the cyclical model of disaster, or at least not the authority of those who claimed to interpret it. In several cases, the vernacular writings mocked the predictions, portraying the elite as fearmongers seeking to consolidate power. The political dimension of these tensions grew sharper as the AI processed more material. Among the most telling translations were accounts of debates between factions over resource distribution during times of stress. One faction argued for centralized control to ensure equitable distribution. The other favored local autonomy, claiming that centralized authority would become corrupt. These arguments, preserved in stone and clay, ended with decisions that sometimes prove fatal for the survival of entire regions. The AI was careful to render these disputes without bias, but the parallels to modern geopolitical conflicts were difficult to ignore. Other discoveries took the narrative beyond politics and into realms of science and technology. Several artifacts once thought to be religious idols were revealed through translation to be schematic models. One carved basalt pillar bore markings that, when deciphered, described the function of a water filtration system capable of purifying brackish or contaminated sources. Another object, a series of concentric wooden rings with etched patterns, turned out to be a teaching tool for tracking lunar and solar eclipses over centuries. These objects suggested that the civilization had a deep, practical understanding of natural systems, and applied that knowledge toward resilience in the face of environmental volatility. Yet despite their sophistication, the AI uncovered repeated failures, moments when the society's leaders ignored their own models and protocols. In some cases, these failures were tied to overconfidence during long periods of stability. Records told of storehouses left unfilled because harvests had been good for many years, or watch posts abandoned because the signs had been quiet. The AI noted that these lapses were often followed by abrupt disasters that erased decades of accumulated security. This pattern, of building systems only to neglect them in times of apparent calm, was one the AI flagged as a recurring vulnerability in human behavior, ancient and modern alike. The deeper the translations went, the more unsettling the tone became. Later records began to take on a quality that the AI's sentiment analysis classified as urgent and almost pleading. These texts spoke of watching the same mistakes repeated by each successive generation, as though the civilization's memory was long enough to recognize its own cyclical self-destruction. One particularly disturbing inscription described an attempt to break the wheel of recurrence, an effort that involved dispersing critical knowledge across vast distances so that no single disaster could destroy it all. The AI interpreted this as an early form of redundancy planning, much like how modern data centers operate in multiple locations. However, there was no sign that this strategy had ultimately succeeded. One of the most mysterious finds came from a coastal site now partially submerged. Divers recovered what appeared to be a set of stone discs covered in tight, spiraling text. The AI translated them as navigational guides, not for ships on open water, but for escaping the encroaching tides of the age. The text described inland routes, elevation markers, and areas marked as safe for settlement during the final flood. Geological surveys confirmed that the site itself had been abandoned shortly before a rapid rise in sea levels thousands of years ago. The discs had been left behind, perhaps for others who might come later, others who might face the same inexorable advance of the water. Another aspect that emerged from the translations was the civilization's fascination with what they called the Watchers Beneath. This phrase referred to entities, possibly symbolic, possibly real, that were said to dwell in hidden places and observe the surface world. The AI struggled to determine whether this was metaphor or literal belief, but certain descriptions linked these watchers to seismic activity, as though the ancients had anthropomorphized the forces beneath the Earth's crust. The record spoke of periods when the watchers stirred, triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that reshaped entire landscapes. Whether these were purely mythic attributions or coded references to geological phenomena remained an open question. The AI's synthesis of the language began to reveal that the civilization's worldview was neither purely scientific nor purely mythic, but a fusion of the two. They approached the natural world with empirical observation, while framing their understanding in symbolic narratives that conveyed both data and meaning. This hybrid model may have allowed knowledge to persist through oral and ritual transmission, even when literacy rates were low. The AI found that many of the symbols carved into monuments doubled as memory aids for complex information, enabling those trained in the tradition to recall vast amounts of data from a single image. What made this realization so unnerving was the recognition that these symbols had been designed to endure even after the language itself was forgotten. The AI calculated that certain pictographs were constructed from shapes universally associated with survival cues, water sources, shelter, danger, which could be understood even by people outside the culture. In effect, the ancients had been thinking not just of their own descendants, but of entirely different peoples who might one day inhabit their land. The research team began to suspect that the civilization's obsession with encoding and redundancy was the result of having lived through multiple cycles of collapse. The language itself carried evidence of such cycles, older forms of words embedded inside newer constructions like fossils in rock. The AI noted that certain root words had remained unchanged for millennia, often those tied to survival essentials, food, water, shelter, while terms for governance, art, and trade shifted more rapidly, as if reflecting the transient nature of political and cultural arrangements. In the stages of translation, the AI unlocked what appeared to be an extraordinary project undertaken by the ancients, a structured archive meant to be discovered far in the future. This archive, spread across different regions and media, contained a condensed record of their accumulated knowledge, from agricultural techniques to astronomical charts. The instructions for accessing it were deliberately cryptic, requiring familiarity with both the language and the cycles they revered. It was as if they had constructed a time-locked message to civilizations yet unborn, trusting that only those who had reached a certain level of understanding would be able to open it. The AI's processing speed meant that each day brought new revelations, each adding depth to the portrait of this long-lost culture. But the tone of the messages remained constant, a blend of warning, preparation, and resignation. There was a sense that the ancients had accepted the inevitability of the cycles even as they fought to endure them. This acceptance did not diminish their efforts. It seemed instead to sharpen them. They built for collapse as much as they built for prosperity, their monuments serving both as symbols of achievement and as guideposts for survival. And as the translations mounted, the AI began to form a conclusion of its own, articulated in the cold, statistical language of probabilities. Civilizations that recognize the cycles and prepare accordingly can extend their lifespans, but no record in the dataset indicated that any had managed to escape them entirely. This was the truth the ancients had tried to encode, a truth they must have hoped would be received by those standing at the brink of their own crossing. The AI's breakthroughs emboldened the team to examine artifacts that had previously been considered too damaged or contextless to offer meaning. In one sealed chamber beneath a collapsed stone complex, they uncovered a cache of thin metal sheets, each etched with symbols so fine that they required magnification to study. The AI determined that these were not ceremonial items, but compact data records, storing condensed layers of information through micro-engraving techniques that could only be appreciated if one knew how to read their spatial arrangement. These sheets contained highly structured lists of numbers and variables, paired with minimal text, suggesting they were designed for quick reference in critical moments rather than for narrative storytelling. When translated, the numbers revealed temperature ranges, wind patterns, and seasonal cycle lengths over spans of centuries. They also included outliers, abrupt deviations from the norm, which were annotated in the ancient tongue as turnings or shifts of the Great Balance. This choice of wording implied that the culture recognized not only gradual trends but sudden catastrophic changes in their environment. The fact that such deviations were grouped together in a portable, durable medium hinted at a society constantly aware of the possibility of crisis, ready to carry its essential knowledge during forced migration. In another site, deep in a desert basin, the AI was fed inscriptions carved into a cliff face that stretched for nearly half a kilometer. Unlike previous finds, these were arranged in vertical columns rather than horizontal lines, and their size varied from easily visible to markings that could only be discerned when the sun struck at a precise angle. Analysis suggested this layout was intentional, meant to be read in stages with certain sections revealed only at specific times of year. The text chronicled a great dying of plant life, followed by mass animal migrations, then famine. Most chilling was its ending, an appeal to the keepers of the patterns to carry the memory of what had occurred into the next turning of the sky. Some of the most striking translations came from textiles woven with repeating geometric patterns. Initially assumed to be decorative, these designs, once decoded, were shown to be mathematical encodings of instructions. The AI realized that variations in color and stitch type represented numerical values, and that each sequence corresponded to agricultural cycles, when to plant, when to harvest, and when to conserve resources. This revelation forced a rethinking of how the civilization disseminated practical knowledge. By embedding survival data in clothing, they ensured that the information traveled with individuals, even in times of displacement. The AI's growing lexicon allowed it to piece together complex metaphors that had once seemed opaque. One recurring phrase, translated literally as "the mouth that eats the light," turned out to refer to prolonged solar eclipses and periods of atmospheric dimming, likely the result of volcanic eruptions or dust storms. Another phrase, "the bones of the earth rising," was linked to geological upheavals, such as tectonic shifts and mountain formation. These expressions revealed not just observational skill, but an ability to encode phenomena in ways that would be memorable across generations. Archaeologists were astonished to learn from the AI's work that the civilization had a sophisticated approach to resource mapping. Several stone slabs, each covered in spirals and branching lines, were identified as topographic representations of water tables. The AI discovered consistent markers for underground springs, mineral-rich soils, and areas prone to flooding. These maps were not scaled in a way familiar to modern cartography, but they conveyed relative positions and environmental hazards with precision. What startled researchers was that some of these ancient indicators matched present-day hydrological surveys almost exactly, proving that the ancients' empirical mapping methods had been remarkably accurate. Further south, in a volcanic highland, excavations revealed a series of obsidian mirrors, each with inscriptions etched along the rim. The AI determined that these were instruments for both astronomical observation and ceremonial use. The translations described how, when aligned in certain ways, the mirrors could be used to track the phases of the moon and even detect subtle changes in the sun's appearance. Alongside this technical guidance were invocations urging the observers to watch for the dimming before the storm, a phenomenon still debated by the research team, possibly a reference to solar anomalies preceding major climate events. In a wind-scoured canyon, explorers discovered rock pillars engraved with overlapping layers of text, some so eroded that human eyes could barely perceive them. The AI reconstructed the missing parts by cross-referencing similar inscriptions found elsewhere. The resulting translation told the story of a migration forced by the loss of arable land, with precise records of routes, seasonal obstacles, and the carrying capacity of different regions. This level of logistical detail pointed to organized, large-scale relocation efforts, a scale of planning far beyond what historians had believed was possible for such an ancient culture. The AI also uncovered subtle variations in the language that indicated a hierarchy of urgency. Certain symbols, when placed at the beginning of a line, signaled that the content was meant to be acted upon immediately. Others indicated information intended for long-term preservation rather than immediate use. This coding system suggested that the ancients understood the value of prioritizing information during crises, ensuring that the most actionable data could be found without delay. An especially unusual find came from a mountainous region where inscriptions were carved into the walls of a narrow pass. These texts described in extraordinary detail a season without end, in which snow and ice persisted long past their expected time, devastating crops and isolating communities. The inscriptions offered specific advice for surviving such conditions, including the construction of underground shelters and the cultivation of cold-tolerant plants. The AI's analysis concluded that these writings were likely responses to a prolonged volcanic winter or an extended climatic anomaly. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on AI decoding ancient languages and uncovering potentially terrifying secrets? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.